Well, ladies and gentlemen, Javier Rivera is outstanding. His contributions to the net are always more than appreciated. His Substack is just full of insight, and he has been on fire with his YouTube lives, his insights, his reflections on everything from lack to excess to anxiety, philosopher anxiety, what exactly we do when we talk philosophy, institution, online spaces, always bring so many different insights to the floor, and is always very appreciated and is always really delightful to speak with. I remember that time we spoke with Trey for about 4 hours, which was a thrill. And we've had the pleasure of knowing Javier for years now. Isn't that something? Isn't it amazing how it goes by?
Yes, sir.
And always enjoy the conversation very much. And today, there's a number of topics that we are looking to speak on because with Javier, he's always exploring many topics at the same time, which I think is a secret to why he's able to bring so many things together in an insightful way. But I know you've been very interested in anxiety lately, and anxiety is really interesting to me because it makes me think of the difference between fear and anxiety. I know you've been reading Kierkegaard, Buber. We see it in Heidegger, we see it in Lacan, we see it in many. And it's interesting because what exactly is this anxiety? What characterizes its experience? So a few things, why have you grown interested in it? What do you think about when you think anxiety? What thinkers have you been considering anxiety through? An open door to you, Mr. Rivera. And again, always a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Um, yeah, I kind of got duped. Kind of got duped into the project, actually. I really the idea came out just from an innocent question. I came up to one of my psychology of religion professors and I was like, "Hey, have you ever considered a course on anxiety?" And she was like, "No. But why don't you draw up the resources and make the plans, basically?" And well, I kind of just, I was like, okay, I mean, that sounds interesting because my proposal was how can we look at anxiety from a multi-view angle, anthropology, biology, everything else. What can we see, understand? But I think my main goal is to show how the discourse of the problem, the idea that the more we talk about the problem, the more we question the problem, the more we start to unravel that we don't need a quote, quote, think a solution to anxiety. The problem already unravels itself as a necessity to keep questioning it. And then ironically, I think it would appease anxiety too, the more we sort of question and prod the discourse of the problem.
Mm.
You know.
Well, that makes me think, one, of your piece on problems and solutions and how we tend to uh, find solutions to problems without going into the problem itself and seeing that if we pull on the problem, it dissolves, or that the solution is in the problem, or different things like that. I think that was a really nice reflection, like you were talking about, on the concept of having a dad. Like, what is a dad? And when you examine, you're like, well, I don't even know what it is to have a dad. So why do I feel a problem in not having one? What is exactly going on? That does make me think of Derrida and his way of going into text and finding these little threads and pulling on them and seeing that the whole thing can kind of unravel. Or, as you know, Derrida loved to go to the footnotes of books because he's like, so many of those critical assumptions are hidden in the footnotes. And indeed, it would seem like we often find solutions outside of problems as opposed to in the problem as the problem. Because it would seem to be most of the times what we think are problems are actually just things we've posited and thus made a problem, but they in themselves are not problems. Which, one, I wonder if anxiety is precisely the realization that we can do that. Like, you come to realize that humans are capable of presenting themselves with problems that actually aren't problems. Well, then what's a real problem? Like, there's something about anxiety, because I'm very interested in the difference between anxiety and fear, because they're not the same, and yet they seem the same. Fear, the first thing one wants to say is that fear seems to have an object. There's a lion, whereas anxiety seems to lack an object, but it's its own object. That's what's kind of weird. Like the subject-object divide collapses, where we are anxious about anxiety. Like anxiety produces its own being, per se, its own experience. So the first thing is there's something about anxiety is that the realization of positing semblances that don't actually have substance, that then we treat as if have substance because we have that ability. And thus the anxiety is also a strange realization of our power. Like we have a kind of power to be able to do this, which is terrifying. It's like, oh my, it's almost like I wonder, because now I'm thinking Livingston and Human, all that. It's like in like the myth of the Midas touch, where he realizes that whatever he touches turns to gold. He's like, oh my gosh, oh crap. Like, what do I do now? And it's almost like there's something about anxiety that is the realization that we have some sort of power, that we're able to touch things or posit things. And oh my gosh, I didn't know I could do that. Now I have to confront this thing. Now that I know I can touch stuff and turn it to gold, I have to confront the reality that I can turn stuff to gold. So the first thing I wanted, there's something interesting about anxiety being participatory. Us as subjects are participating in its being and then horrified by that being of which we bring about through our participation. There's something interesting there that our ordinary approach to problems and solutions hides. Like the way we often approach problems and solution kinds of hides this character of anxiety.
Yeah, I like the Midas touch because it reminds me of how Kierkegaard and Heidegger kind of fancy on the same threads, where it's like our Midas touch is the possibility of freedom. That's actually what's very terrifying for us. And so anxiety, at least for Kierkegaard and Heidegger, it seems, and at least for a lot of people, a lot of the philosophers, anxiety is the most honest mood, affect, right? But what is it telling us? Kierkegaard would say you found yourself in your untruth, right? So that is something that is immediately, it's like realizing that you've been captured, you know? And so it seems like the Midas touch that is so frightful is that it's the possibility of freedom that's frightening for us. That we cannot think about another possibility. Just thinking about another possibility of being is frightening.
Right.
You know, and then the moment you catch yourself in that idea of like, oh, maybe I can't be this way or I shouldn't be this way, is already the understanding that you've been caught in your unfreedom and you're sort of anxious about it. But it seems like maybe anxiety arises before you even realize that, like fully understand that as epiphany. And so I think, you know, the fear and anxiety distinction is actually really fascinating because I recently read a kind of recently published study from psychiatry where they were studying the brain kind of functions on trying to distinguish between fear and anxiety, and they said it resembles the same.
Yeah.
And immediately I thought, well, this is, to me, this has to be the shortcomings of a kind of like objective science because, you know, only philosophy can really make this subjective distinction between fear and anxiety at this point, because there does seem to be a distinction, and I think we obviously cannot find that distinction within just a materialist observation, because I think you're right. You will come up, you know, like they showed in the study, the fear and anxiety showed up the same patterns, the same colors were being used in the charts, in the images. So, but I do like this debate because it seems like Lacan, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Lacan seems to be one of the few that actually asserts anxiety as an object. And I think this is actually a very fascinating course of history for anxiety because Tillich says anxiety doesn't have an object. Kierkegaard basically asserts the same. I think even Freud essentially said something like anxiety is the loss of the object.
Yep.
But what is actually fascinating about this even further is like the concept of object for Lacan, if I'm understanding, is not the way that we understand object, right? So anxiety that has an object is not the understanding that we know of object. It's kind of like you said before, lack is the object, if I'm understanding this correctly, or becomes the object itself. So in that case, Lacan is, and I think in a paradoxical way, he doesn't actually go against them. He actually kind of stretches it further to say that anxiety has an object. It's just not an object in the formal sense that we understand object.
That's a very good reading. A few things. First off, you better be sure that professor pays you if you make this class. Second, poor Javier is going to be like, I don't know if I want to ask about it. They're going to make me do a class. Oh, gosh. But so you better get paid for that. Second, the reading you brought is very good. There's a few things. One, On the difference between anxiety and fear, because they have the same brain scans, I wonder if it's the difference between like the Chambers zombie Daniel and Daniel who's conscious. Like the zombie Daniel, you know, that thought experiment, it's the body, it's all Daniel, but he's lacking the qualia, he's lacking the subject of Daniel. And what's the difference between zombie Daniel and Daniel, who's actually himself? There might be something there. You can't, there's something missing, and yet there's nothing missing. That's what the whole zombie experiment is supposed to be. It also makes me think about the difference between mind and brain that Cadell will speak on. What's the difference? We know there's a difference, and yet when you look for the difference, you don't see the difference. Therefore, you know, Cadell's paper on brain versus mind wants to suggest that the mind has something to do with that Lacanian lack. And yet this is what's so strange on what you're pointing at. So there are terms that are thrown around in philosophy like virtual, where virtual is an actual possibility. It is nothing, but it also isn't just nothing, right? And what Lacan by lack means is not nothing. You know, Mr. Jockin and I had that conversation where lack is not nothing, right? It is a present absence. So it's a virtual object. It is, and this is what's so strange. So through history, what seems to, like if we take a Hegelian historical notion, for most of history, lack doesn't have anxiety doesn't have an object, right? Because that's how the historic moment. But now, as consciousness gains awareness about anxiety and examines anxiety, anxiety itself becomes an object of anxiety, because you like, why do I have anxiety? Anxiety can't come from nothing. It has to come from a lack. So lack has to be some kind of object, but not an object in the same way that other things are. And this is where, as you know, in the philosophy of glimpses, it seems like there's a third ontology. Like you have a thing, you have no thing, and then you have this lack or non-thing with the NO in parentheses, right? Because in Lacan, lack creates excess, and excess creates lack. Well, how in the world is that possible? Like, what is going on? Now, I think we've also spoken about the word lack in maybe being a problematic term precisely because it may lean too much on the side of nothing. Whereas for me, you start talking about no thing with the NO in parentheses, incomplete with the IN incomplete. And the question is no thing, NO in parentheses, an object? We know that a thing is an object, and we also know that nothing isn't an object. So the question is no thing with the NO in parentheses an object? And that's where the term virtual comes out. And I'm going to sound like a novice now. I'm actually curious what lack is in French for Lacan. Like, is there a different term that was translated into lack, which then brings itself too much on the one-sidedness of nothing? And so anxiety, then, the object of anxiety is some sort of weird incompleteness, this weird IN incompleteness. And this is, I guess, what we're asking. Is mind an object? Right? We know brain is an object, right? Is mind an object? Well, you say, yes, it's brain. Oh, but it's not equivalent with brain, right? Like the mind requires the brain, but it's also irreducible to the brain, right? That's Cadell's paper, and that's what a lot of people now say, vector theory, Bard, along all these different people. All right, so what is the object of mind? Is mind an object or not? Is it a partial object? Is it a virtual object? For me, this is what Lacan's getting at with lack. Like lack becomes, in whatever way mind is an object, is the way that lack is an object. And the object of anxiety is that object, whatever that object is, or non-object with the NO in parentheses. And we're at a historic moment where we are aware of that paradoxical character of it. Whereas up to this moment, up through Tillich and Kierkegaard or whatever, there's not the meta-awareness, if you will, of it at an object, where really like Lacan kind of announces, if you grant me that, a kind of like, oh no, actually we're actually aware of this thing as an object. So it's kind of like almost a historic epoch, almost like an introduction of a new kind of epoch. And so then the question is, what does it mean to think this virtual object or non-object with the parentheses around the non? It's also really tricky because now this makes me think of your reading hearing piece. Like the very fact that this is hard to talk about because every time you have to clarify parentheses NO, right there suggests the limits of something. In the same way that there's some sort of limit in regard to discussing the difference between mind and brain. Like the moment you talk about that, there's some kind of limit, infinitude itself in regard to communicate it. It's almost like the difficulty of speaking about this third ontology as the NO in parentheses suggests that this is some sort of push. it's the very conversation kind of suggests the problem in its structure, which Derrida would love, and like an on grammatology and writing and speaking all being problem. For me, and then I'll give it back to you, the very fact that the topic of anxiety brings you to this border of the problem of the mediums of writing versus speech, which for Derrida was what structured metaphysics, right? For Derrida, metaphysics was structured by the medium of its communication, right? So we're trying to communicate something here that is difficult to communicate because it exists in a between space between writing and speaking, right? That would be evidence then that this is a topic which philosophy should focus on if we take a Derridian take. And the fact that anxiety brings one here would suggest that I think anxiety is worthy of focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I have been recently equating myself a little bit more with Lacan, especially the seminar on anxiety. I can shout out to Cadell last for telling me to get myself acquainted with it. I recently just read something on that seminar where Lacan mentions that anxiety is that something that the lack is lacking. I really enjoyed that kind of framework because it that already shows its in-betweenness already, in my opinion, right? Where the discourse of history for philosophy has been like, why something and not nothing, right? So automatically there's this kind of anxiety about why is there something, why not nothing? And then we're constantly bouncing back and forth between this something and nothing. But you can already tell that this anxious questioning of whether it's something or whether it's nothing is already anxiety interplaying as the mediator between these two frameworks as opposites. And so you can really tell that Shakespeare kind of got it right when it's this question of like to be or to not be. And we're constantly haunted by that question of to be or not be. And Kierkegaard kind of responds with, well, either way, you're screwed.
Either or.
Yeah, either or, right? But it's, yeah, I do like Lacan's explanation on this because it's like, he basically says that our investment in something already carries within itself a reservoir. So like, that means that all of a sudden when that representation fails, it's like the lack that's lacking. And then like the way I understood this with my novice self reading this, it's kind of like, if I believe there's a God, okay, so I have a kind of lack, and that lack is fixated by there being a God and me being good, but then all of a sudden God is dead, right? Let's just take this in the literal sense. God is dead. So then where does my lack go? My lack is now lacking. I don't have anything to do with myself now. And this is anxiety. Like this is what it is. Mm-hmm. At least that's why I understand it from Lacan. And so you bringing up speech. I was reading like a more, I guess like 2019 book on Lacan's, it was commenting on Lacan's seminar on anxiety, where he says, speech is intimately linked with desire. Yeah. And so it did make me think about writing as like, what would writing be like? Because it's almost like the opposite is that there's no desire without speech, which makes me think about Derrida in very interesting ways that I never considered before. But yes, I do fundamentally think there is this kind of interesting in-betweenness from speech and writing to consider.
Well, how can we desire something we can't access? How can we think it's good we can't access it? How can we think that it's good that it exists in a manner that cannot be fully represented? Like, can we desire that and really mean it? Well, a way that religions got civilization through that for a very long time was positing a God. Like, we really do not appreciate religions as psychotechnologies. We remove religion thinking that they were just some wish fulfillment and some, dream or whatever. Turned out that they had a lot of extremely valuable psychotechnological functions, such as providing people a plausible way of life that organized around a thing they could never fully access, but could access enough to motivate them to keep living and to desire it, to structure their speech and their writing in a manner that felt meaningful and plausible to them, while at the same time not making that entity fully capturable and thus in service of power or the state or government. religion as psychotechnology is not fully appreciated. And I think we're starting to maybe appreciate it as a globe, and we need to do some more so. A few more things. I might use the term third thing. You know, the first thing is a being, the second thing is a nothing, the third thing is lack. So by third thing, I'll just mean lack, or nothing with the NO in parentheses. And again, like we mentioned in our last net conversation, there's something here about the needing to kind of go through terms that is interesting to me. Sorting through terms, looking for language, and that very shuffling of the deck constantly also suggests a new form of communication that is working beyond on grammatology, or taking what Derrida told us to kind of find this way to operate in this new linguistical space to describe this third thing that doesn't fit easily in speech or in writing, frankly. Because even when you put it in writing, then it becomes like Hegel and it's difficult to read, right? So it's difficult to find this middle space. And maybe the internet is the new form of the notepad or the book or the microphone that is enabling a new way of talk about this third thing. That seems to be very important. There's something about also with this third thing is the moment I go to be or not to be in regard to the bookshelf, would you like me to throw you in the sea of trouble or hurl some slings of arrows at you? I then turn the bookcase instantly into a thing that can be questioned. I've changed it with the Midas touch. It is now something lacking the answer to that question. And oh, wait a minute, the answer never appears. So I've now turned it into a third thing just by asking about it. This would be for David Hume, absolute skepticism. The fact that I can look at anything in this room or any subject on planet Earth and turn it into a thing that lacks a transcendental grounding. Until I ask about it, it practically does have a transcendental grounding because I just use it. But the moment I ask about it, wait a minute, how do I know that bookcase is actually a bookcase? It's gone. And it's like it was never there, actually. It's a representation. Actually, you can do for any object the same thing of the death of God. Because what does the death of God mean? That God was never even there to die, right? That's the weird thing about the death of God, right? Is that not only, it's not that God was and then he isn't, it's that he was never there not to be. And that's kind of the weirdness, right? And it turns out that God was always virtual in that sense, right? He was not actually a thing. So likewise, it actually, here's the funny thing. It turns out everything is like that, actually. The moment you ask, how do I know that bookcase is actually a bookcase? It's like it was never a bookcase. It was always a virtual object that I was only experiencing because my consciousness structured it as thus toward me. So the Midas touch, the philosophical Midas touch, as Livingston describes David Hume, is actually the ability to make any phenomenon in the universe undergo a death of God by turning it into a third thing. I can turn everything in the universe into a third thing, okay? Anxiety seems to be the realization that we have that power and we can't stop using that power. Now that we have philosophical consciousness, now that we have philosophy, and this is where David Hume is so concerned about the spread of philosophical consciousness, of which cannot be reversed because you can't close Pandora's box once you open it, right? You know, once it's open, you can't reverse it. So you have this spread of philosophical consciousness where now everyone is an existentialist, as Peter Berger said. Now everyone is philosophical. So that means there's this unleashing of the philosophical Midas touch, which means that everything in the universe can by human beings now be turned into a third thing. Everything can be undergoing the death of God. And anxiety seems to be the feeling of the realization that we have that power, that we can't stop using that power. And that power is something where in the end we may touch ourselves and turn ourselves to gold, as the Midas touch goes, right? So the anxiety is this realization we've unleashed this Midas touch to turn everything into third things. And now it's coming for us. And we ourselves are now turned into a third thing. And we can't stop it and we can't reverse it. There's no un-Midas touch per se. There's no reverse Midas touch. There's no soft scrub Midas touch where you just take a little soft scrub and you rub it on the statue and it turns back to human from gold, right? And so anxiety seems to be, the unleashing seems to have something to do with the unleashing of a philosophical consciousness that makes everyone on planet Earth have philosophical Midas touch, that gives everyone the ability to turn everything into a third thing, and now we can't turn it back. And we find ourselves having to live in a universe of third things, and we have not, and then it would also seem that anxiety is the realization that we don't know how to live with this. Arguably, absolute knowing is the state where you come to accept this reality and then come to live with it, but the majority of people do not have absolute knowing. And perhaps anxiety arises from the finding yourself in a universe of third things without the absolute knowing to handle it. Maybe that's a part of the disconnect. So those are some things that come to mind first.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny because it seems like the AI race is like that
Yes,
that
that's
thing, right?
exactly right. That's 100% what's going on. It's a representation of that very structure. Very good connection.
We've turned ourselves into the third thing.
Yes, 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 yes. AI is
That's why we're so
AI
scared.
is forcing the question. AI is forcing us to realize we've done this. Yes.
Yes. And yeah, I think you're right. It becomes this task to get to that absolute knowing that you're talking about. Um, yeah, it's like I don't even know where to begin to even like change the discourse on this because it's like people, at least the popular conception of anxiety is like there's good anxiety in the sense of like you're going to take a test and you should have some type of anxiousness. But then there's like the bad kind of anxiety where it's like people feel like they're so hindered they can't even like function. But to me, that is already a kind of anxiety that it is already showing their unfreedom, which is ironic because what is so interesting about the biological symptoms of anxiety is heart rate. You can't breathe. You're struggling to breathe, right? So there's already a kind of suffocation going on with the narrowness and the squeezing of anxiety, which to me already proves that you have been caught in unfreedom.
Yes.
And but the thing that we keep doing is we keep pacifying ourselves to remain there. And so I'm constantly intrigued by this passive, pacification that is going on because actually, if we put a limit on it, then it would give us anxiety, but then it would make us ask the question, okay, so if you couldn't pop pills to appease your anxiety, what would you do? What would you do? If we limit that, what would you do? If there were no medical fields, what would you do with anxiety? Um, Now that's a really interesting thing to consider because now we have to think about what our options are.
Yes.
And already we are in the act of becoming just by asking that question. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Excellent. For David Hume, you have to re-embed in common life, take seriously friendship, lived experience, and make the abstract in service of. You have to make the abstract in service of the concrete. And what ends up happening when the abstract is more fundamental than the concrete, when the idea of what the bookcase is more important to you than the phenomenon of the bookcase, you're lost in an endless void of anxiety and self-deconstruction. And no matter how many pills you take, until you stop thinking of the idea of the bookcase as more real than the bookcase, you will never get better because you have to get the order right. And that applies to Hegel as well. No amount of pills can reverse philosophical consciousness, only finishing the philosophical journey. That's big for David Hume. You can only deal with the problem of philosophical consciousness by completing the journey of philosophy, which is the return to common life, the embedding in common life. For Hegel, it's the acceptance of absolute knowing. So, for example, another way to put this, anxiety seems to arise when you find yourself in an absolute knowing universe, per se, without absolute knowing. Okay? So you're caught. You find yourself in a universe of absolute knowing that is constituted by AK. I'll just say AK. This whole conversation, since you're on the border, is going to have these reshuffling of the language. So you're in an AK universe without absolute knowing. So for Hegel, it's like the only way to deal with that is to get to absolute knowing. You have to finish the journey, right? And so for Hegel, it's like for Hume, once philosophical consciousness is unleashed, as he identifies and he refers to the English government as undergoing the barbaricism of refinement, because now government is trying to base itself on an original contract or hypothetical state of nature as opposed to the lived experience of the community. And he says every form of government of which is based on a philosophical notion like justice, freedom, equality, doesn't matter. He said that's going to become a tyranny because you cannot base a government on a notion. It has to be based on a people. Now, that inevitably is going to be favoring decentralization, leopard code, breakdown of nations, small governments, small states. Of course it will. And now what is everyone saying today? We need to return to decentralization, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, all these different things are basically screaming that maybe those Scottish Enlightenment people weren't so crazy after all. And then, of course, there's the funny reading of Heidegger as actually being part of the Scottish Enlightenment without knowing it. But let me just note that. Anyway, so what we have is anxiety seems to arise between finding yourself in an AK universe without absolute knowing. Okay. So then you basically have to get to the end. You have to get to the end. And if you don't get to the end, what ends up happening is you fall into what Hume called philosophical melancholia, which I think is basically the main constitution of the meaning crisis today. What's very strange, actually, for David Hume, it is precisely the desire for philosophical meaning that causes meaning crises. The problem is, what I do worry about is a lot of people's solutions to the meaning crisis is philosophical meaning. And Mr. Ebert has mentioned this, and we mentioned this at the Net. And obviously, I've just had the pleasure of doing that presentation with Cadell on David Hume to Hegel and different things. So I've been writing way too many papers going back on all that because I'm like, oh right, this was this subject really matters. So glad you're here. So what David Hume at the beginning of the Inquiry of Human Understanding refers to as philosophical melancholia is basically anxiety. And it's basically also what is causing the meaning crisis today, in my opinion. The forcefulness of everyone realizing I have this Midas touch and I see everything as groundless. But then the problem is if they're trying to solve it with philosophical answers, that will actually make it worse and worse and worse. So this is where understanding the correct constitution of anxiety is really, really important. Now, it should be noted, for many philosophers, anxiety and sloth go together. Now, sloth does not mean lazy. That's a terrible translation. Sloth means the inability to see meaning. Like sloth is where you don't see significance in what you could do. It's not lazy. It's where you look around and say, what's the point? Okay. That's more of what sloth is. And what's funny is anxiety and sloth tend to go together, because if you're always feeling anxious, one of the ways to get out of anxiety is to say, nothing matters. Oh, I don't feel anxious anymore. Because that's basically the only medication you have to anxiety if you don't finish the philosophical journey, where you just say nothing matters. So the funny thing is, a lot of the meaning crisis is actually a way that people have solved the problem of anxiety. Like they've gone into the meaning crisis because they didn't know how to go through the anxiety. So that means so to your point on problems and solutions, now we're trying to solve the meaning crisis, which arguably doesn't solve the anxiety crisis per se. And it's a distraction. It could be a distraction. Now, I want to make very clear, meaning matters. There's a lot of things that people in the meaning crisis communities are doing that are very helpful for people, et cetera, so forth. It's never in these what's very important, usually in these conversations, it's not wrong versus right. It's complete versus incomplete. It's ordering. Right? You obviously need meaning. The question is, can you give yourself meaning and in the same act deal with the problem of anxiety? The answer is no. But if you have a meaning problem, you have to address that, but then also address the anxiety problem, right? And then the economics problem, and then the family problem, and so on and so forth. I think that's what's very interesting about these online another unique character of these philosophical discourses today is that it's not so much right versus wrong, such as it is complete versus incomplete ordering and so on and so forth. Because I think you're getting to such a level of nuance in the philosophical discussion where it's and also people simply have access to YouTube, internet, and so on. It doesn't tend to be the case that people are like utterly obviously wrong. It's that everyone has pieces per se and it's a matter of order then. It's a matter of fitting things together and what's primary, what's not primary, and different things like that. And to me, the reason why we have to see the meaning crisis as a kind of response to the problem of anxiety that addressing, though, would not solve the problem of anxiety is because if you deal with the meaning crisis, but anxiety has not been addressed, well, people are going to fall right back into it. And then it might actually be way worse in the same way that Jesus is like, hey, you take out a demon, but don't put something good in its place. Seven more are coming back and it's going to be way worse. I very much am concerned about that. And to me, anxiety has so much to do with the question of the feeling of being in an AK universe without absolute knowing and how you navigate through that and what that looks like. And that's where then you start seeing, like, if you take seriously Kierkegaard in the Buber debate that you've mentioned, that's where stuff like that starts to arise. Those are some thoughts.
Yeah. It seems like anxiety is from some of my readings on Kierkegaard, it seems like anxiety is that directive for Kierkegaard. Like it is the way. It is your way to have a kind of self-relation to truth. So for Kierkegaard, it's kind of like a guide. But I actually think that this is a good guide because when I start having like anxiety about my ideas or something, in a very Kierkegaardian sense, I can take this as like, anxiety is the mechanism that leads me to a kind of right ordering. That it keeps prompting me to reorder and give an ordering of the structure. So, and that means if I'm having anxiety, it's possible that I have like a wrong ordering, and then I've trapped myself in a sort of wrong ordering. I found myself in untruth. I found myself in unfreedom. So I really enjoy Kierkegaard's take on this, because it's ironic because he does kind of sound more Hegelian than I give credit. That there is actually an argument that I've recently encountered where Kierkegaard doesn't really critique Hegel as much. He critiques the Hegelians.
Yes.
So I think that's an argument worth entertaining because it does seem like Kierkegaard specifically attacks the Hegelians and not necessarily Hegel. And it does seem like anxiety and faith seems to be like very good ordering functions, because I'm still haunted by Hegel's introduction, where he talks about like the criteria is already there. You kind of just have to be there to play it out, essentially. And I feel like he is advocating for a kind of faith, but that faith kind of seems is inseparable from anxiety. Yeah, I'll leave you
Excellent,
comment.
excellent. A few things. First, I was about to say that you should never feel anxiety about any of your ideas, but then I would be cursing you. So I hope you feel anxious about all your ideas
Thank
every
you.
time and very nervous whenever you put something out. Second, there is an extremely good argument, and Zizek even points this out in Organs Without Bodies or Bodies, Organs Without Bodies or whatever, where Kierkegaard is incredibly Hegelian, and doesn't know it, or he knows it. It's no, like when I say to you, hey, Jesus gave rise to like thousands of denominations that vehemently oppose one another. We don't go, oh, well, that's weird. We all kind of know that's what happens. When you have someone that brings like a different character or quality to history, there's like lots of different views. And then those different schools actually like literally oppose one another, right? Hegel brings such a crazy density of thought, in my opinion, that he does something similar to what a lot of religious founders did. Like we know Sufis and Sunnites and Shiites are all very different in Islam, right? To the point where they're like ready to fight over it, right? Well, likewise, Hegel generates a lot of different views of Hegel that those different schools are actually combating one another and actually think the others have nothing to do with Hegel and that we get to the real Hegel, and that's like religious, right? Like that character of fragmentation that we've seen in many religions, starting around a religious figure, we can see in Hegel here. And not just Hegel. I'm not saying that proves he's the greatest philosopher. I'm just saying that because of what he is doing, it is prone to do that. And then, of course, it doesn't help when you have Marx read Hegel and he turns Hegel on his head and brings about this material dialectic, of which then Hegel would, I'd be very curious what Hegel would say to Marx. He's like, Marx, if you're not going to read the science of logic, shut up. Because the science of logic is indeed making the argument that you can't turn Hegel on his head because nature and notion are two sides of the same coin. So you cannot take notion and replace it with nature, which like Marx basically does, because nature and notion don't mean what we think they are. Their ontological character is mixed up. So there's no way to, a material dialectic is nonsensical, because a dialectic exists precisely because there is some sort of there is some sort of tension between material and idea. So you can't have a material dialectic because the dialectic is itself constituted by the strange character of ideas and material relating. Okay. So but once Marx does what Marx does, and you have all the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians, then you get all of that. But, and one also has to realize the nature of philosophical discussion will forever change due to the internet. Kierkegaard does not have access to 50 different freaking Hegel scholars like we do with YouTube, right? Nietzsche does not have access to Dostoevsky and all the Christian existentialists or whatever at his fingertips, right? So you're going to have, on the history of philosophy up to this point, you're probably going to have a lot of vehement disagreements that if those same people were alive today, they would probably be much more nuanced in their discussion, right? You start seeing increasingly like Rene Girard in Battle to the End, when he's critiquing, he says, I'm probably not critiquing Hegel, I'm critiquing Hegelians, right? He makes that point. You're going to see way more philosophers making that move because the internet has enabled them to make that move because they're able to see the explosion of interpretation. So I think you're going to see a different character in the way that philosophers structure themselves against one another or for one another, or then there was a lot more of, in the past before the internet, there's a whole lot of I'm not them, I'm this versus that. I disagree with them on this way because of the lack of access to resources by which to think of the text. Today, I think the character of the language is going to be way more complete, incomplete, complete, overfitting, underfitting, emphasis, underemphasis. You're going to see a lot of that because the internet is going to make people aware that very often thinkers who devote their life to a subject, they don't tend to be entirely wrong, right? If you sacrifice your entire life to do something, you're probably not entirely wrong if it's a written project. Now, if it's like a cult where you've been kind of brainwashed into accepting something, maybe, but like literally day in, day out, you're revisiting a thought and it's costing you money and it's costing you time and maybe you're like bankrupt because of it, it's very unlikely. Or if like Kierkegaard doesn't get married to Sophie, I believe it's Sophia, the girl he's going to like, he pays a price, right? So it's really unlikely when people pay a price that they're entirely wrong. It tends to be that they're incomplete or they emphasize something over something else, right? Like we don't see a robust examination of economics in Zizek, right? Well, should we? Like, do you expect to? Like, what do you want? You want a thinker to be an expert on every subject known to man? I mean, are you nuts? And I think we're going to become more attuned to this reality of completion versus incompletion. And I think what you're saying on Kierkegaard. In regard to anxiety as well, what seems to be so critical is that as you undergo anxiety, you come to kind of ask philosophical questions, right? Whereas when you ask questions of fear, you're like, how do I get away from? Like there's a revelation, even if the brain scans are correct, on the kind of way you respond. It's very clear when you're afraid of something, your response, it's not like how should I respond? You just naturally get away, move, avoid, deal with. Whereas anxiety, it's interesting how the response to that is much more confused. Like that might be a hint on some differences. A feeling of fear tends to bring with it a sense of what you should do, more so. Whereas anxiety tends to bring a feeling of I don't know what to do. So fear tends to be in, out. Anxiety tends to be in, circular. Okay? So there's something there going on. And then if it's circular, what's interesting, and then I'll give it back to you, fear seems to be more like a line, and these are important terms in Hegel, whereas anxiety is more like a circle. And if it's a circle, it could be a true infinity. That means it could be a negation sublation that is positivized. So this gets into the question, as you brought up, on how to positivize lack. What does it mean to positivize anxiety? And you were mentioning that, right? Like this feeling of, this idea, how do I know that it's actually good? Like with Kierkegaard, it creates an anxiety that makes you revisit it. So there seems to be some way to take anxiety and make it positive, which thus means there's a way to take the experience of realizing you're in an AK universe without absolute knowing and positivize it, ergo into gaining absolute knowing, one would think. But there's also something about anxiety. There's an interesting something here about positivizing anxiety in the same way that Peter Rollins, as the great Rollins, positivizes the death of God. Oh, God has died, therefore the idol of God can die. Jesus as idol can be removed for Jesus as Trinity, Jesus as himself, right? So Peter Rollins and the whole pyro theology is positivizing the death of God to make possible the actual event of God, right? So anxiety could be positivizing the event of which anxiety suggests, right? So there are questions here of positivizing anxiety.
Yeah, one of my favorite lines that I read was Kierkegaard saying God is possibility. I really like this line because it shows that if Kierkegaard is right in saying that anxiety has something to do with the conflict of eternity and time meeting in tension, then it already shows that there's something, at least for Kierkegaard, that there's a sort of immanence in God sort of emerging from that tension, and that is God as possibility. What I think is really funny about the talk about positivizing anxiety is like, if we look at it now, where is there room for courage in our society if we're already so civilized, so to speak, right? So beyond just violence and control, where is there room for actual personal courage? And I feel like there seems to be no sense of personal courage, at least from the more just subjective sense, rather than the more physical, violent control kind of debate of like, police and everything else. But it seems like if we put a limit on this question and we say, okay, there's no police, there's no order, what are you going to do?
Mm.
Right. And so it seems like we tend to strip away these responsibilities. And actually, Derrida makes a very good critique of responsibility as it being a sort of like ironic contradiction, where it's like you have to ironically lean on a system of thought for you to know what to be responsible for. But anxiety in relation to responsibility is this exact uncertainty. What am I responsible for? Well, there you go. That's the responsibility. That very questioning of like, what is that? Um, and so if we take away that responsibility, then we sort of lean into either like a self-negating self, actually what you brought up with you could do the skeptical thing where you just say like, okay, everything's nothing, and just actually Kierkegaard calls that the demonic anxiety.
Yep.
Right? Where he said that he's reached the pinnacle of truth, but failed to have a self-relation to truth.
Yep.
And I think that's a very perfect example of that. And I think some of that responsibility, like Kierkegaard points out, is like, and I think Hegel too, is that responsibility of having a self-relation to truth. But it cannot be, I would say it cannot be like some blind system thought. It has to really be like a kind of like sense of like, I don't know what that is, but you have to take a risk. And I think Tillich is obviously very fruitful in this conversation, making courage an ontological thing rather than a virtue. What else? I mean, yeah, that's why I like talking about anxiety, because it just opens up the avenue of like responsibility, freedom, existence. Um, to go more to your distinction on fear and anxiety, it's funny because if you if you self-explore with drugs, what's really funny about anxiety in the state of being intoxicated is that we often say things like, "What is that? Oh my gosh, what is that? I don't know what that is." Um, and you can see how already anxiety has the kind of grounding for philosophical questions. We're curious as to what that is. What is that? What is that thing before me? Whereas fear, it seems to be a very clear indicator of like, this is a threat. Like you said, I need to get away from it. But anxiety seems already to ask questions of philosophy. What is that? What am I? What am I? This is why I like the anime Ghost in the Shell, because the main character, actually asks a real human question. What am I? Where did I come from? And yet we as humans have stopped asking that question. But AI is now re-provoking that question upon ourselves, and we're afraid of this. And it's so ironic that we're called the age of anxiety. Because I keep thinking like, okay, so how did the other ages deal with it? Why is it that we're the age of anxiety? So there's already something there to probe and question. But yeah.
Well, outstanding. Well, there's a few things where it's almost like up through history, there are problems out there and we find the solution out there and we make the problem go away, and gradually we become the problem. And if we make ourselves go away, well, it's over, right? So if we are the problem somehow deeply ontologically, then solution changes in quality, not merely in quantity. It has to be like the nature of solution is forever different. And I think the age of anxiety is an encountering of a historic development of Geist or spirit, if you will, in which problems are no longer out there to be solved and made go away. It's a movement where we ourselves are the problem. And if we find a solution that makes us go away, like AI, and it just takes over the earth and kills us all, like that guy was saying the other day, well, that's not really a optimal solution. So basically, if human beings are like right now, like if we're stuck in a problem solution mindset as opposed to a problem slash solution mindset, AI will destroy us all, because basically the only way to learn to live with it is to change the quality of our thinking about problems and solutions, right? And that is, I think, the characteristic of an AIDS of anxiety, is where problems and solutions are changing in quality. Like what problems and solutions are no longer what we think they are. It's like we were saying at the net. A limit isn't what we think it is. A problem isn't what we think it is. A solution isn't what we think it is. So there's this infinite transform, like it's basically all concepts, all notions are undergoing a kind of transconfiguration. I almost want to use an alchemy term. What's that term in alchemy? Like Full Metal Alchemist. We're talking anime,
Yeah,
so like transfiguration or whatever.
I think that's
Like
right, Tim.
everything is undergoing a kind of everything is undergoing a transconfiguration before our very eyes, or we're screwed. So it's like you're screwed or transconfiguration. That transconfiguration is what I call the absolute choice. We have to choose to accept the idea that the being of spirit is a bone, A, B, the spirit is a material object. Humans are a mixture of nature and notion. They are ontologically A, B, to use all of my language. We have to accept that, or AI does us away, because we only, like, there's no other option basically. And so the AIDS of anxiety is basically the facing of the absolute choice or nothing, basically. Another way to look at it, you brought this up quite well with Mr. Kierkegaard. There's that phrase of nothing matters, right? Well, there's nothing, that's ultimate nihilism, or it could be ultimate salvation, because you say nothing matters and everything is nothing. Same phrase, but it completely. So here's the key. The change is not in the wording. The change is in our relationship to the wording. Yeah. The wording's the same, but in one way we say, well, then screw it all. In another way we say, well, if everything because of the Midas touch is a kind of nothing, and nothing matters, now it's a third thing. And we've come to accept that third thing as mattering. Now an AK universe is aligned with absolute knowing. You know how there's a lot of talk with AI and the alignment problem? Like we can't figure out how to align humans with AI. Like we're facing the alignment problem between an AK universe and absolute knowing. We don't have absolute knowing, and we have to get in alignment with an AK universe, or we're going to undergo effacement. You know, there's that term Kierkegaard uses too, infinite absolute negation, that comes from Hegel. And the infinite absolute negation is basically where we're screwed. Like irony can always ironize about irony and ironize on irony. You can go forever, sarcasm, all the way down. That's the infinite absolute negation. Like you can always go further down. Likewise, the Midas touch. I can always make a thing be groundless. So human beings have the ability to make the universe undergo infinite absolute negation. And it turns out, here's the problem. Once you realize you can make the bookcase be groundless because of the Midas touch, well, then everything in the universe can be made that. So there's no, like, once you do one thing, the horizon of all things changes, right? If you're able to take a picture of one tree with a camera, now all trees are things that can be taken a picture of. Do you understand what I'm saying? So likewise, once you realize the philosophical Midas touch, everything in the universe changes. So you go from absolute negation to infinite absolute negation, just like that. Once you realize you can ironize about irony and ironize about irony and go on forever. So here's the question. That means nothing matters. Okay. So does it matter in the third thing, like negation sublation way, or in the nihilistic way? Anxiety arises between that choice. Anxiety arises between that choice. And so learning to live with that choice, if you can't live with that choice, you can't make that choice. And basically the failure to make the choice is the nihilism, because like the choice is to accept it or not. Like if you don't accept the Midas touch, that's nihilism. Like I don't accept this, I don't get this, I don't know what to do with it, then you're screwed. Whereas accepting the absolute choice is to, in fact, accept the call of anxiety. It's almost like anxiety puts a demand on you. That's the issue. Like anxiety puts a demand on you. What you going to do about me? You could say it's the demand of freedom. Anxiety, this is why I think freedom and anxiety are tied together. Because between nihilism and transconfiguration, there's a choice. You're free. There's a freedom there, right? And because there's a freedom, there's an anxiety. It's the same way that like again, Once you gain the ability to do the Midas touch, I'll say for short, to turn everything into a third thing, you're free to turn everything into a third thing. And why don't you? You see, now there's a call. The freedom brings a why not? And you can't avoid the why not. And so you do. And it's almost like once you gain the freedom, you lose the freedom not to exercise the freedom. That's what's so weird. Like once a freedom is gained, then it's there. Once AI is invented, then it spreads. It's almost like you can't stop it. Well, that's weird. And so it goes with this kind of transconfiguration. Once the Midas touch occurs, then it occurs. And basically, the absolute choice comes at the end of the expression of a freedom you cannot stop. Like once the freedom is unleashed to turn everything into a third thing, you can't stop it. And the absolute choice comes at the end of choosing what does that mean and how will I respond to it. And in the age of anxiety seems to be increasingly the facing of that choice, which is being even more forced upon us because of artificial intelligence. And the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, it's funny because it actually reminds me of Uber saying, the only true evil is a man that doesn't make a choice.
Yeah.
Right. And so I like this framing because it's sort of like putting it in a moralizing framework of, oh, there's bad and good. Buber seems to say, actually, just you not making a choice seems to be the worst thing that you could do. And so we're constantly presented with this. Like, I think dichotomies would probably have to be like the biggest trap of all.
Yes.
I think that's exactly where the anxiety arises, right? Where it's like, okay, well, you can have to be a bum or you could be a productive member of society, right? But immediately you start having anxiety because you're like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. There seems to be something wrong with both of these pictures here that I'm being subjected to. And so already anxiety is channeling us to think about what is that possibility. And this is why I like anxiety as a sort of initiative, as a guide, because clearly when I get stuck, I start having anxiety. I'm like, oh my God, this is a wrong idea. But of course, that's when you've already found yourself in that unfreedom. So yeah, I think there's a way that I think Hegel can be interpreted where like the criteria is anxiety.
Hmm.
The criteria in the interpretation of the phenomenon of spirit is anxiety. Where it's like because he says something, I always love this phrase. He says, all you have to do is look on. So that already is entailing a type of choice, that is already entailing a type of courage. I have to trust, in a very, very bland contemporary wording, I have to trust the process, essentially, right? But there's something very important with what Hegel's saying, because in order to trust the process, you have to live the process. So you can't it's not just like logically accepting what Hegel is saying. And this is why I gave my whole argument about like, I think Hegel already gave me room to not read the rest of this book.
Oh, sure.
Because he already negated himself as a gift by saying, look, if you really trust what I'm saying, then you would trust this criteria. And what's ironic about this criteria is that it's always going to fail because you have a representation of what that criteria is. But you have to look on. So I am really fascinated by Hegel's introduction on this concept, just because it already entails the fact that we have to receive the criteria. We have to be willing to accept the criteria, have courage, and that looking on is having courage in spite of not knowing, because not knowing means that you are not enforcing a kind of criteria upon the world. You're allowing the criteria to play itself out, whatever that may be. But of course, making a choice, ironically, means you have to succumb to some kind of criteria, to construct a kind of criteria, but then also knows that when it fails, that's the criteria playing out. Right?
Excellent. There is certainly a way in which books are the gems by which we train for anxiety. Interpretation, like, I don't think it's by chance that when you have a culture that doesn't deal with the arts or it doesn't read books, et cetera, so forth, that it's really bad with anxiety. Because if you're all like, when you're like, what's your interpretation of Hegel? you're always training and dealing with I really believe this, but I'm not sure because other people have different, like the arts and the humanities constantly put you in the realm of dealing with experiences of anxiety where the stakes are low, right? Like before you get into like global governments and should we shut down all AI or not, let's work on interpreting Dostoevsky. Okay. It's like your training wheels almost. And what's really bad is like basically we have a culture that doesn't read, doesn't deal in ideas, which I'm not moralizing that, but in the same way, I'm not moralizing going to the gym, but there is a very objective consequence where if you do not exercise, you have a higher likelihood of getting a heart attack. It's not definite, but we're always dealing with probabilities, right? Likewise, if you have a culture that doesn't deal with books, which again, if you deal with books, you're always around people that do, so you lose sight of the wider culture. But if you have a culture of people that don't deal with ideas, then they're not trained in anxiety, basically, or to live with anxiety on smaller scales, smaller notions when the stakes are not high. And we're about to throw that culture into the biggest cause of anxiety in human history, probably, which would be artificial intelligence. It's not a good match. It doesn't look good. It would be like throwing someone into a situation where they never went to the gym and suddenly they're pinned under a boulder or something, and the only way they survive is to push it off. The probability that adrenaline will be able to give them enough to push the boulder off is low. Maybe, maybe not. Or if you were to throw them into the ocean without any physical training and they have to swim back to the shore to survive, the likelihood is low. It's not impossible, because little is impossible, Kierkegaard possibility, but it's improbable. And one of the keys is not to, one of the keys to thinking well is to not think in terms of possibilities, but in probabilities when it comes to socioeconomic situations, obviously. Yeah. So this is something. And I think reading is training for anxiety and living, and also disagreement. Like, that's the other thing. People people don't read, and you learn in reading how to discuss disagreement and different views without killing one another or whatever. So people don't train in that, and then they get into like relational fights that are more intense, right? So the likelihood that those relational fights between people and spouses and neighbors don't blow up is much lower because they don't have training in smaller areas, right? It's like less weight on the bar, and then you work up and you can do more, right? Like, so you do less weight on the bar and you work up. Like, we have a culture of people that want to go straight toward the most intense disagreements when they don't even have training in realms where the stakes are lower. Yeah, you may get upset with one another because you disagree on your reading of Zizek or whatever, but that's not the same as like screaming that you're a bad like husband or something. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, we don't, like, a way to look at books and the arts and the humanities is as training grounds for anxiety, disagreement, possibility, because a book is an infinite possibility of interpretations, right? So much of what the humanities are doing is training in these realms of anxiety so that you're better at them in other levels of society where the stakes are higher. Like, the stakes are higher, frankly, because you're literally poor now. You're literally divorced now. You literally lost your job now. You literally are not able to figure out what you want to do with your life now, and ergo you're in depression and so on and so forth. So it's important to note those things, I think. Also, like, on the notion of like how, like, with Hegel and the looking on in different things, like, it's so important. Like Hegel's basically, it's funny how he has the looking on in the phenomenology, but not the science of logic. Because the science of logic, he's like the reason the phenomenology is like, oh, okay, you guys think this science of logic is crazy? Well, you give me a better explanation for how history develops, how consciousness develops, and how notion goes on, right? You give me, like, Hegel is basically positioning history as a kind of mathematical proof that the science of logic is valid. Because if indeed the subject develops according to what is laid out in the phenomenology of spirit, that all functions as a kind of proof that is then what what is described in the science of logic is indeed the case, right? Like, so imagine you had the phenomenology of spirit was the description of the planting of a tree, a seed. Like, you planted a seed, and the next chapter is about rain, and it grows into a plant, right? And he's like, okay, so you saw the plant grow, right? You saw it. You looked up and you saw that occur, right? Okay, the science of logic is about how seeds work, how germination works, right? You have reason to believe that the science of logic is right in its description of germination because you saw the tree grow from the plant. Imagine you got a book about seeds germinating and you never even heard of a seed. You would be like, the frick is this? This is nonsense. There's no such thing as germination. So the phenomenology, because in a strict sense, and Dr. Holgate points this out, phenomenology is not a philosophy. You know, a phenomenology in this sense. Now, I personally think there's some complexifications that have to be done in that, because basically I think if notion and nature are two sides of the same coin, then phenomenology and philosophy are two sides of the same coin. But this is always what's tricky in Hegel. If the science of logic is correct, then the phenomenology is actually part of the philosophy. And I think that's a step that's kind of moved. It is the case that the phenomenology for Hegel can be left behind, almost like the ladder in Wittgenstein can be kicked away. But if the science of logic is correct, well, then the phenomenology is actually the other side of the science of logic. So like you go linearly and then you go backwards and now they all go together. So there's a funny move that goes on there. I also think it applies to the elements of the philosophy of right, which I know is fragments out of the encyclopedia, but that's another topic because it's Hegel's justification of Hegel, as I like to put it. Anyway, the key also with the looking on, with the phenomenology spirit, is Hegel's like, you ain't got to read me. Just pay attention to the world. How does the world unfold? If you pay attention, his claim is pretty ballsy. He's like, if you just like pay attention to how the world works, you're going to be reading this book. And actually, if you think about it, all true philosophy has to be like that. Like if true philosophy has to, in theory, be something you can arrive at without reading the book. Because if you have to read the book, that means it's not in the world. So this is why philosophy is always a very interesting field, because true philosophy must be things you can arrive at without studying philosophy. Whereas, say, science, like it's literally impossible to observe atoms without the telescope, right? Like you could not reach many scientific conclusions without the laboratory condition, right? The laboratory of philosophy is life itself. That means every single human being, without reading philosophy, should, in theory, be able to arrive at the conclusions of philosophy without ever reading philosophy. That is incredibly unique as a characteristic, right? It's the other side of the notion that philosophy can be about anything. You know, Samuel Barnes will talk about, and we've talked about, you can always philosophize about anything, but that means anything can be philosophy. That reverses, right? And so that's what Hegel kind of realizes. He's kind of pointing out, he's like, look, you don't have to read this book to reach the conclusions, because these conclusions, I believe, are part of life itself. Now, of course, you could say, you're an arrogant prick, dude. How dare you think that? But that's also where he's showing you can't do philosophy without taking a stand. Like you have to take a stand and be like, I believe this philosophy in this book could be arrived at by anyone who simply pays attention to life. And I'm taking that stand because if I don't take that stand, I wouldn't write this book. That means he has to face anxiety, because I promise you, he wondered if what he was writing was true or not, because everyone does. And so you see courage and philosophy and anxiety are all wrapped up in one another, because also you have to believe what your eyes see. Like if you say, I believe when I pay attention to this door, that A is A and Aristotle doesn't quite work because the door is always changing through time. Well, you have to trust your own observation. That's anxiety, because you're going to go down and say, hey, everyone, I'm not sure if A is A is true. Daniel, are you crazy? If anything is true, A is true. You have lost your freaking mind. He's like, no, guys, but if you... So there's like, in the assertion of a philosophical point, there has to be a willingness to be seen as crazy. So there's something there where, and also then to Tillich, indeed, courage is ontological, because the way that reality is conditioned toward you and you are conditioned toward reality is relative to if you have courage or not. Literally, the world that unfolds before you is relative to your ability to be not afraid. And so it is ontological because it transforms how things are structured and your ability to apprehend. Try reading a book when you're nervous about failing a test. Doesn't your mind not remember things? Doesn't your brain go out the next day? You can't. But what's it like to read a book? Like, hey, you would be a great example. What's it like to read a book for class versus what's it like to read a book that you want to read? What's the difference? Are not the books entirely different? Well, right there, you see that courage and anxiety have a different impact. Now, I'm not saying you should be afraid of your test. I'm not saying that, but you see that emotional orientation has something to do with apprehension, and apprehension changes the world. And so you see an ontological reality, just like Tillich is getting at, precisely in the difference between reading a book for a class because you're afraid of failing a test and reading a book because you believe that your life depends on this, because there's some sort of truth here that can help you organize your life differently.
Yeah. Oh man, you said a lot of gold stuff here. Mine is touching. um, yeah, I really like your formulations on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and logic. Because I feel like I kind of reached the same conclusion actually when I read that introduction, where it was like, it's weird, and I'd be curious what your interpretation. Um, I feel like Hegel actually does this move already in the beginning of Phenomenology of Spirit, where he actually negates his own authority,
Yes.
ironically enough.
Yeah, he does.
He negates
Absolutely.
his own authority in order to make room for his authority, in the sense of like, look, you don't have to believe me.
Yes.
In fact, you could probably stop reading right now.
Yep.
But if you do look on, whether it be through my works or not, you're going to discover that basically I'm correct.
Yes.
Not in an authority type sense of like I am correct as an authority, but more like for yourself, you will see this, you will witness this,
Yes.
you will encounter this. And so that's what already provoked me. And it's so funny that when we talk about reading other authors or philosophical thinkers, I'm always in conflict with what people say about Hegel in terms of like the authors that I like Kierkegaard and Martin Buber, because every time I hear their criticism, I'm just like, I don't understand where you got that criticism, you know, because like Martin Buber basically says like, oh, Hegel, he turns it into like a god by himself, unraveling himself in history. And Martin Buber disagrees with that because obviously, you know, he's about the dialect, you know, the dialogical encounter where you can't have just this one, you have to have being and counter being in order to have a dialogue. Um, but I feel like there's already room for that in Hegel. Um, Believe it or not, you know, there's room for that. And even Kierkegaard's um, critique is interesting because he talks about like he tried to invert Hegel too. He said he tries to take away knowledge. But it's funny because when you talk about absolute knowing, it's kind of like understanding that, oh yeah, there is this nothing kind of like thing, right? So that's where I'm like, I feel like actually Kierkegaard was really attacking the Hegelians, not Hegel. Um, and so yeah, I feel like when I encounter criticism from a thinker that I like, and then I just from conversations from like you, Cadell, everybody that likes talking about Hegel, I'm just like, yeah, it doesn't add up. Like the critiques don't add up when I think about the more contemporary understanding of Hegel. It doesn't add up.
Well, and
Um,
I'll just comment. I think, again, we're entering a kind of historic moment where we basically, like, a lot of academia has spent all its time, like, discussing those disagreements. I think we're entering a time where that's not productive, simply because the disagreements often are simply a result of technological limitation. Like Kierkegaard was a human too. He struggled to read Hegel just like we do, just like Buber, everyone, right? Because these books are difficult. And Kierkegaard is reading from the zeitgeist of his day's reading of Hegel. So we cannot say Hegel, like it's so easy to go, well, Kierkegaard was an idiot. If you were Kierkegaard, you would have done the same freaking thing. You didn't have the internet. There was no like. Look, in the reading of absolute knowing as a knowing of limitation, this isn't just Zizek. You can go back to Mestolf Wolf in his book of History and the Time, like absolute knowing in the 70s. There's a lot of people talking about absolute knowing as a knowing of the limitation, right? Where you come to this different limitation. The issue is another way to think about Hegel is that he is constantly playing between the traditions of capithatic theology and apophatic theology. So his God is completely unknowable, and history is the gathering up of an unknowable God. Well, that's funny. Like, what does that even mean? That history is the arrival at an apophatic state. So, yeah, there's a kind of gathering, but the thing that is gathering is precisely in the gathering is as it gathers more, it becomes more of a truth that cannot be known in the whole. But also, if the truth is known in the whole, then something of the whole can be deduced from every part. So you have this weird blending of the capithatic and the apophatic, because Hegel is also going to be reading some Jewish mysticism, a lot of the mystics, he's playing on that. So also, I go back and forth on Strauss, but when Strauss talks about Straussian readings and having to read between the lines of different things, there's a lot of that goes on in these thinkers as well. Where good literature, look, good literature is not overt, right? So it's going to be sort of talking. You don't want to end a book with like, oh, and in the end, we just know limits and it kind of sucks, right? You want to end with something that sounds like you rose to the occasion, even if embedded in that is a rising the occasion of a knowing of limit. The victory is a knowing of a limit. And now how do we rule with those limits, right? Like, what does that look like, right? So there's something about having to know what it means to write a book, how to think a book, what Hegel is doing. But the point I was basically getting at, and I'll get back to you, is that we need to not, we've had the discussion, it's going to all be about philosophical developmentalism, basically. Like, okay, we know Kierkegaard and Buber disagree, right? Do you want to write a PhD about that? Or do we want to talk about how they're both right and need to be fit together? Like, right? Like, the age for me, like, if we want to talk about what's the difference between academic philosophy and philosophy online, academic philosophy is where you would have spent 30 years studying the disagreement between Buber and freaking Kierkegaard. The online philosophy is where we figure out how to fit them together, right? That's the difference. And if the online space doesn't do that, then it's simply going to be the modern university online, which is not different in quality, just different in location. We want a different in quality, and a difference in quality online is going to be asking, how can Kierkegaard and Buber go together? And the basis for figuring that out is going to be experience. So what do I mean by that? Okay. So we know Buber is like, no, you mentioned it in your video. You encounter God in community, and Kierkegaard's like, no, it's between you and the individual. All right, phenomenologically, do we start in community or do we start as an individual? Outside of the Buber Kierkegaard, this is how you can bring all three together. You're saying like, Hegel's like, hey, you don't have to read me, but if you think, like you think this through, you're going to think like me. Don't think like me because of my authority. Just think on your own, and you're going to come back to me, not because I'm better than you, but simply because this is the case, right? Like no one, like what Hegel says right there sounds audacious, but is that not what scientists do? Like scientists do that. Scientists are like, dude, if you went in the laboratory, it would, you know, I'm telling you like how, I am telling you how black holes work, okay? And you can say, and I'm telling you, if you went into the laboratory and you did the same experiments I did, you would think like me. Not because of my authority, not because I'm an arrogant a-hole, because literally that's where the experiment would lead you, right? So that's all that Hegel's saying. He's like, Hegel's saying the same thing. He's like, philosophy is, as a rigorous study, will do the same thing. It's not arrogant. It's no different than a scientist telling you that. Anyway, so if we take that seriously, though, where phenomenology and experience looking up is the organizing principle of thought, well, then the looking on is how we determine the way to fit Buber and Kierkegaard together, right? So what do we see? Do we see that people are able to have relationships without facing themselves? In my experience, the answer is no. When people do not come to terms with themselves as a subject, which gets into Lacan's The Real, they tend to have really toxic relationships, right? So, but at the same time, if people stay individuals and they never go into relationships, they seem lacking. They seem, well, I shouldn't use lack because that's a loaded term. They seem, there's something missing. They end up like the Japanese origami that live in their apartment all day, however you say the term, right? So it would be as if you encounter God in community, but you must go through the development of the subject as in Kierkegaard precisely so you can have the encounter in community. Whereas if you go straight to community, it seems like, yes, that's where you can experience God, but it seems to break down. Maybe also there's something where for one phase of your life, you encounter God as an individual, but then you reach a limit, like in the phenomenological journey, where now you're at the limit, and now you're only going to get it in community, so you must transition to Buber. In my opinion, but this is where a valid, on the point I'm about to make, this is where a valid debate can be had, unlike the stupid academic debates. The valid debate is my following claim. It would seem to be the case that Kierkegaard comes first, then Buber. Maybe not always, but often it does. Now, in these online spaces for debate, you could come back and say, no, I don't know if individuals know how to face themselves without community. And then I would respond saying, okay, they're born into a family. That's true. So maybe but is the family and community the same? Maybe we start in a family and you need a family to then be able to be an individual. So then you can do community. You see, that could be a debate, but notice the difference of the character of that debate. That's different from saying, no, Kierkegaard's an idiot and Buber's right. So I'm very interested, I bring all that up and I'll give it back to you, on the structure of debate in the online communities, of which are based on phenomenology primarily. Not, oh, but Buber, because in academia they say, well, Buber in page 46 of Between World and, he says X in I and Thou and Kierkegaard and Works of Blood. No, I'm talking your experience. Like, what do you experience? Like, you see, that's for me how the looking on and then the Buber Kierkegaard debates start to go together. And it would seem to me that the character of these online philosophical spaces are ones that follow that structure of debate or discussion. Michelle and I don't call it debate. At that point, it's discussion. It's disagreement and discussion, which is different. That discussion entails debate, but debate does not necessarily entail discussion, in my view, if you use my language. But of course, it depends on your language. There's lots of disagreements in discussions, but the disagreements are always being negated and sublated in the next point. Whereas in a debate, there's no negation sublation. Okay, like there's a disagreement, it just hits. Where in a discussion, it's like it's always there's a discussion. There is so much negation sublation happening that it seems like there's no disagreement. Like that's the issue, and then you're anxious. You're like, oh, well, maybe we're just confirmation Bible or different. That anxiety is evidence of substance. You said it earlier. Precisely the anxiety about the possibility of confirmation bias in these discussions as a result, a semblance that is a result of the negation sublation that occurs, then creates an anxiety about any truth being said, which is precisely evidence that there's some kind of substance. And so all of those come together. So those are some thoughts that came up.
Yeah, I really like this because Kierkegaard, when I started thinking about this problem between the supposed debate between, I mean, obviously it's constructed because Kierkegaard would not have known Buber. So this kind of false construction of a debate between Martin Buber and Kierkegaard is actually very fascinating because it would actually be an error, a huge error to take either side, actually, and the way I kind of configured this is like, all right, let's think about their philosophies in general, okay? So Kierkegaard is saying you have to be an individual, right? But Buber is saying in order for you to be in dialogue, you have to be this basically other, this absolute other, essentially, right? So that way you can understand that you're having a dialogue with an other. So you both have to be this kind of otherness, just standing in your otherness, right?
Right.
Kierkegaard is basically saying the same thing.
Yes.
That you have to be an individual. Well, what does it mean to be an individual? And Buber also hits on the same note. So it's like, what does it mean to really be an other or look at the other? He just kind of goes the other way. He makes you pay attention to protecting the otherness, right? Protecting the otherness of the other, being sort of very careful about what you're doing when you're doing something. And then Kierkegaard is saying to you, well, okay, what does it mean for you to be?
Yes.
Right.
That's
so
correct.
It's the same coin, just on different sides. And so that's why I feel like, honestly, the debate between Kierkegaard and Buber is kind of moot because they're both talking on different sides of the coin. So this thing between individual and community, I mean, it's interesting because it's like you experience that kind of at the same time when you're really actually interacting with people in the world, where you're constantly questioning, wait, what am I as an other? And then what is this person as an other? Because I mean, we experience this all the time in relationships. It's like you changed, what's happening? And then the other person goes to you and says, well, you changed, like you changed too. And then so it becomes this realization of like, we're both changing. And then so we have to answer this question of like, what does it mean to be me? And what does it mean to be you in our complete otherness? And then this is where Kierkegaard and Buber both help us to answer this question, because I do find some faults with Martin Buber because it seems like he doesn't address, he talks about it, but he doesn't go into as much detail as Kierkegaard does by becoming an other. Like Buber really stresses the dialogue, but in terms of like, how do I really become an other? Buber, I mean, he kind of leaves it open and it's kind of really ambiguous, whereas Kierkegaard kind of gives us more of like a, at least in my opinion, more of a map of like, okay, so here's an interesting thing that Kierkegaard says, right? When somebody gives you advice, like I did in my video, by virtue of the other, you already negate the other because you're going, oh, this person is saying for me to be like them. And I don't
Yes.
want to be like them, right? So Kierkegaard is really showing how like automatically dialogue would fail,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And Buber talks about how hard it is to have dialogue, but when you combine it with Kierkegaard, you can see why dialogue fails
Yes.
because the subject is looking at the other guy like, oh, he's trying to tell me how to live my life, and I don't want to be told that. So Kierkegaard says, okay, well, let's approach it indirectly,
Yes.
right? Let's look at nature. Let's look at something that doesn't demand you to be like them. Um, but Buber also says something very interesting in the I and Thou, where he says you can't try to anticipate the other. It kind of looks like a kind of suffering. Um, so Buber almost in a sense is saying like you have to also approach it indirectly. Like you can't come in with this anticipation of like this is going to be a dialogue. I'm going to meet my I and Thou. That negates the whole experience. So I really do think there's room for the both of them. They both elaborate on each other, in my opinion, very well. And then, of course, when I start reading Hegel, I mean, that just adds another further elaboration. So if we can think of the developmentalism as a kind of further elaboration, then I think you're right. You know, that there's ways to talk about these thinkers that they elaborate on each other instead of focusing on like, okay, does God come first in community or does God, I mean, to me, that's like it becomes a moot question at a certain point. But I think when we start thinking about how they elaborate each other on their insights, I mean, both Kierkegaard and Buber make room for each other,
Yes.
right? That's why I found it so funny about this conversation, like the debate, because I was like, it's funny because Kierkegaard says in order for you to be an individual, you have to have a absolute relation to the truth. You have to have
Yes.
a relation to the truth, right? That means the disagreement that they're having, this made up disagreement between Buber and Kierkegaard, is Buber has found a relation to the truth. He's actually living Kierkegaard's way,
Yes.
actually.
Yes.
That's the irony. And then Buber talks about how in order for you to have dialogue, that person has to be an other, like a real other. So that means Kierkegaard already fits in Buber's system too as a real other, as somebody that's already automatically kind of opposing Buber. So the real question is, can we both experience Kierkegaard and Buber at the same time, which would be actually Martin Buber's philosophy, because that's what dialogue is
Yes.
supposed to be, where I experience the other while still maintaining my ground without giving it up. And Kierkegaard just basically makes the same point with, hey, have your subjective truth, stand as an individual, stand as this other. Um, so yeah, I'm curious what you're
Yeah,
gonna
no,
say.
outstanding. There's a few things. One, I would say the high majority of academic and quote unquote debates and disagreements in human history have been emphasis. They've been emphasis disagreements. Do you on it like so? I always do a kind of thought experiment. I always imagine Kierkegaard sitting down with Buber and Buber telling him what he thought. I cannot imagine Kierkegaard looking at Buber and saying, "You're wrong." It's unimaginable. It's unimaginable reading works of love. Like Kierkegaard would never look at
Yeah,
Buber and be like, "You're wrong."
yeah,
And I find it very difficult that whatever criticism, if Bilber was saying, well, this is the problems with your system, I strongly doubt that Kierkegaard would not have a response. Would be like, no, I can see what you think I'm saying that, but really based on this, blah, 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 blah. In the same way that if Buber was talking to Kierkegaard and, you know, picking apart Kierkegaard and talking about the lack of Kierkegaard, like, well, of course. I just can't imagine Kierkegaard not going, of course, yes. But you just have to be, as a subject, work through the place where you can handle community. Because you have to ask Martin Buber, is Jonestown an I-thou relationship? Is a cult an I-thou relationship? And Seems like it is to me. Why not? You say, well, no, because you're exploiting people toward the end of Jonestown. That's not how the people phenomenologically experienced it. They experienced it as true brotherhood, true community. You now can retrospectively say it was used for a purpose. It wasn't a true community. But yet, that's where you go to the phenomenology. That's where Hegel's right. How did the people in Jonestown experience Jonestown? You can go through all the cults, basically. They always say very similar things. It was the happiest times of my life. And you can say, well, that's twisted. Exactly. Kierkegaard would be like, yeah, it is. So you see, that's the issue. Like, why isn't Hannah Arendt's banality of evil and I thou? You say, why isn't it? Because as far as I can tell, everyone in Nazi Germany felt like they belonged, they had community, they were treating one another like brothers and sisters. That looks like an extraordinary I-thou relationship there. You can now say it's an I-it. Now you can, but at the time, I'm not so sure. Is the kamikaze bomber for the Japanese an I-thou? They seem to treat the emperor like a thou, right? Like they literally called the emperor God. Isn't the thou God, right? Why or why not? You see, these are all so basically what we see, and this is where I think the character of these online discussions are important. Every one of these thinkers, in the same way that the phenomenology of spirit in Hegel is consciousness develops to the point where it reaches its limit, and precisely at that limit, it must now become self-consciousness, reaches the limit, now it becomes reason, and then it has to keep going to spirit, religion, absolute knowing. You do Kierkegaard, reach the limit, and then you go bam, because you go, Kierkegaard, are you saying everyone's going to go to Galt and Atlas Shrugged to be John Galt? Those people don't exist. There is no saint as a John Galt. Oh, crap, bam. Now you're in Buber, you go to the limit, and boom, now you're in Hegel. What's happening, the reason why discussion is superior to debate is because discussion is the only way to get the full examination of the thinker till they hit the limit, and every thinker hits a limit, and once you find the limit, you've found the room for the other. You see, that's what the structure of the phenomenology of spirit is, finding room for otherness in the completeness of an I. Every subject or I, once it tries to reach completeness, inevitably encounters a limit. The problem with most academic debates is we're trying to draw a limit without reaching a completion that unveils incompletion. You said it before, you like to think Buber to the extreme, to where he failed, right? That's how it's supposed to go. But you see, here's the key. Because of information limit technologies, Buber did not have the internet. He didn't even freaking have the phone, really. There was no way to engage in a discussion with Kierkegaard or go through all so you had emphasis debates. They're all emphasis debates. You had emphasis, and there's a place for emphasis. I'm not saying emphasis is bad because that's a way of locating difference. The issue is thinking, here's the problem. The issue is thinking that emphasis is substantive as opposed to accidental. There's nothing wrong with pointing out emphasis in terms of accident. Oh, you could only write so many words a day. Oh, I never had a chance to talk to you. Therefore, there's a lack of emphasis. The problem is academics tend to think a lack of emphasis is evidence of a lack of substance. Oh, this means Kierkegaard didn't think community. Oh, this means that Kierkegaard was an autonomous individualist. No, it just means you didn't focus on those subjects because he was trying to do such a good job on the individual that you could hit the limit, thus undergo the negation, sublation into Buber. You see? And this is where the internet discussions are different. It is now possible to have the advancement between thinkers through the completion of a thinker, because now we have the ability to research and talk in different things to fill a thinker out, hit the limit, bam. Philosophical developmentalism. The very technology of the internet allows for the meta structure of philosophical discussion to now be like the phenomenology of spirit in Hegel. And that's what's so unique now. And that's where truly we're going to see discussion as debate per se. Discussion as a constant encountering of the limit of Kierkegaard, the limit of Buber, the limit of Hegel, Heidegger, all these different things. And you're going to see where Heidegger is missing something, not because you can't fit it, but precisely when you complete Heidegger, that is the same moment of the making space for the other. Same with Nietzsche, same with Kierkegaard and different things like that. And basically, in my opinion, the age when it was acceptable, like I'm taking a Hegelian move now, the age when it was acceptable to write books and to do philosophy in a manner that was like going against other people for a lack of emphasis is over. You no longer are plausibly, it's no longer excusable, because now you have the technology where you don't have to do that. Like for Buber to have done that to Kierkegaard is completely understandable given the technological limitations. Today it's different. This is Hegel. Like now that you're in this historic moment where you have this technology, that kind of way of doing philosophy is no longer excusable. If you continue to do it, you are now in error. Whereas Buber is not in error because of the day that he's born in the same way that Kierkegaard is not in error talking about Hegel because of the time he is born in. Things are different now. And if you don't adjust accordingly, you're out of the game, basically. You're wasting time. This is, and again, there's real urgency precisely because of anxiety, precisely because of AI, precisely because we need to figure out how to bridge the gap between an AK universe and a lack of absolute knowing and to bring those things together. And all of that, by definition, is an exploring of philosophy in terms of the philosophical journey, the phenomenological journey to bring Hume and Hegel together. Failure to do so will contribute to effacement, worse meaning crisis, anxiety that does not know how to positivize itself, and instead will continue to lead to effacement. Those are thoughts.
I'm just associating here because I thought this, because when you were speaking, immediately my thought was like, oh yeah, Jesus at the crucifix saying, Father, why have you forsaken me, is absolute knowing
yes.
at the peak of, at the end of history.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And I was just like, oh my gosh, yeah, that is amazing. Like I was like, why can't I read that interpretation somewhere? I'm sorry if you wrote it already. I apologize.
I think Peter Rollins wrote it. It's fine.
But yeah, yeah, you're right. I think another way to conceptualize this is like with philosophers, because you're already feeding me this idea, is to ask, okay, what are the limits that these philosophers are trying to get at? And I think Kierkegaard, for example, he exposes the limit of what it means to be an individual. Okay, Buber is completely from a different kind of limit. He's trying to tackle a different kind of limit. That limit is dialogue. What does it mean to have dialogue? He is exposing those limits. So automatically, the conversation goes stale when we start talking about emphasis because it's about what Kierkegaard is aiming at for limits.
Yes.
Right? And I think this is where we have room for the developmentalism that you're talking about, is like limits. What is Kierkegaard's intention for a limit? He's talking about the individual for limits. In that sense, he's very fruitful. Buber for dialogue, obviously, again, very fruitful. For the limits of what does it mean to actually have a discussion, a real dialogue. So in that sense, they're very fruitful. But them together is like entangling two limits that just don't make any sense. We're entangling two limits that don't, they need to be separated to understand why they're important. And so I think Hegel is the same thing. I mean, obviously Hegel's like the king of like saying like, look, there's a limit. And then once we transcend that limit, we understand that that was the limit, and so we're constantly approaching a limit. So it seems like for me, earnest philosophizing is like having anxiety about like a limit, like wanting to explore a limit. And I feel like for me, that has to be with anxiety. I feel like maybe that's where my thinking is actually going towards, like the limit. What is anxiety as a limit? What does that mean? What does it look like? Obviously I'm so passionate about my philosophy of passion because I do feel like there's room for it. It's just the way I currently define passion is kind of like maybe moments of absolute knowing in the mist. I'll explain what do I mean by that. What I mean by that is passion seems to have a kind of understanding of like, I know this isn't all that there is, right? That every time I love this thing, there is something that cannot capture that thing that I like, right? So it seems to me like passion might actually be, if I'm connecting Hegel, passion might actually be that kind of framing of where you have this glimmer of absolute knowing, where it's like, that's not what it is. and yet you continue to do so
Yes.
anyways.
Yes.
And yet, ironically, passion, if we go to the original etymology of the word, it has to do with suffering.
Yes. Yes.
It looked like suffering.
Yes.
And that's why I thought about Christ on the cross, passion, it as that being like, why have you forsaken me? And yet he knows there's more to what he is saying,
Yes.
ironically, in that phrase. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where I situate passion itself, and it has to do with my own experiences of passion. Where it's like, when someone says, "Why do you love philosophy?" It's kind of like, oh, I can't give you a reductionist understanding of what I'm talking about, right? Because that means that I would be negating my experiences, my struggles, my anxieties. There's something obviously passionate about why we keep talking and having these discussions. And yet we know there's more to what is actually being said. Um, and that's, to me, those are like glimmers, moments of absolute knowing, but they have to be, they're sort of like provoking you to keep going there. That's why I really like passion, because passion seems to be that like automatic drive there. It's like you latching onto the drive and it's taking you there. But of course, you have to have faith, you have to have passion, you have to have courage. I mean, because that drive is just going to take you, and it's going to take you, and you have to do the Hegelian looking on.
Yes.
So, go ahead.
Oh no, outstanding. There's a few things. It's in the same way that at the net we were saying that learning seems to be learning limits. Like that's the only form of learning, is learning limits. And it would seem like you have to learn Kierkegaard to find the limits of Kierkegaard, but you're only going to find those limits if you genuinely act as if there aren't limits. Because there's a problem where if you knew that when you let's say there's a mountain in the distance, if you knew that there was a river that you couldn't cross to reach the mountain, you wouldn't start your journey. So you have to believe that you're going to reach the mountain to encounter the river, right? And absolute knowing is a state where you know there's going to be a river, and yet you go to the mountain anyway, before you even get to that. That's kind of the extraordinary move, where you actually somehow get to a place of the development of the subject where you know that you're going to encounter a limit, and yet you know that you can only encounter that if you genuinely believe you won't. And now we start to see why contradiction, paradox, and irony are so big in Hegel, because there's some crazy move where the only way to get to where you need to go, which is where you're going to encounter a limit, is by acting as if you won't encounter a limit, all while knowing you will. And this is why Hegel is so strange, I think. This starts to point at why Hegel is so strange and why Kierkegaard is so brilliant to emphasize irony and paradox and all these things, and all those things have to be explored. Likewise, the moment you go limits of Kierkegaard, limits of Buber, put them together, contradiction, Hegel's like, yes, real thinking is contradiction. So now you have to think that contradiction. How do they go together? Well, guess what? Relative to their thinking, they don't go together. You have to bring in a third thing. What's the third thing? Life itself. That's why if you don't ever look on, without phenomenology or experience, you cannot negate sublate thinkers. It's not possible, because Buber and Kierkegaard to themselves as internally consistent systems that discover limits of their systems precisely thanks to the internal consistency cannot go together. If you want to put them together, you must go outside to life. And then you start organizing how they can go together based on experience. And then you bring that in. Here's the problem. In academia, you're not allowed to do that. You can't bring in life. You have to stick to the debate. And so there's no negation sublation in academia, basically. Online, it's now possible to do that. It's now possible to dance between the thinkers and life and start bringing in a third thing to resolve the otherwise irresolvable contradiction. Right? That's what happens in the phenomenology of journey, as Cadell calls, of Hegel. There's an introduction of a third thing every point, and then boom, you've moved. Boom, you've moved. Boom, you've learned. And so that's something that can now happen online that you're basically not allowed to do in academia, because no, you're not supposed to talk about your lived experience. You know, and that's just where the woke people have a good point. Like, we've kicked out lived experience and we need lived experience to get it true. That's correct. The problem is you're introducing lived experience in terms of political activism, as opposed to lived experience in terms of phenomenology like Hegel's getting at, right? So there's truth, but there's a miscalibration on the nature of that lived experience, right? So the bringing together of that contradiction, then bringing in lived experience to figure out how to resolve, then we can talk about Heidegger. Same with Heidegger. You need Heidegger's clearing, right? But if you stick within the internal consistency of Heidegger, you end up in Duginism. Now you could end up in Duginism. Now I have to explain all that, et cetera, so forth. But I also think it's erroneous to assume that Heidegger must lead to Duginism, right? Because there's this developmentalism that can be considered. Same with Nietzsche, so on and so on and so on. So basically the variable of your life, your personal experience, your subject, is the only way to resolve, to negate, sublate the contradictions of these thinkers. Without that, you can't order them, and that's something that the online spaces can do that couldn't happen in academia.
Yeah, no, I agree. One of the most beneficial things I did, is reading for myself. This is something that's really important, because I think we can get ourselves stuck in a kind of self-negating loophole.
Yeah.
Where it's like self-relating negativity, I mean, where it's like you can stay within the framework of a thinker and you can keep spitting out rote memorizations of what the thinker said about other said thinker, or you can actually choose to read that other thinker and encounter for yourself your own interpretation.
Right.
Actually, my own interpretation of Hegel, I'm very sort of happy about, because it sort of appeased a lot of the general disagreements that I had about Hegel. And now I'm even more curious, if I were to continue on reading it, how it would actually shape me and my understanding, to kind of appease some of the things that I find contradictory with what Buber said about Hegel, or what Kierkegaard said about Hegel. There is an interesting logic, though, with academia, which I feel like is called. I recently read something about Muzzini's logic. Logic of prevention goes into logic of deterrence. What does this look like? Prevention is this. It's basically like, if we're just going to put this in the context of nuclear war, right? We don't want a nuclear war, right? So we try to prevent it. Muzzini basically says, well, what happens with this is that prevention goes into deterrence, means that it instantly becomes a race to seize that power in order to deter anybody else from using it.
That's right.
And what's ironic about this is that academia is the same thing. They are trying to prevent a critique or prevent a limitation from happening.
Yes.
And in order to prevent that limitation, they have to seize the power of the interpretation from happening.
Yep.
Right, from finding that limit. And that is what's even more dangerous, because we don't see how we even do it to ourselves. This is in the same thing with identity. I am trying to race to deter anybody that challenges my identity, and so instantly, I think Muzzini is kind of right with this logic, where you can't even see how the philosopher himself can get trapped in his own enjoyment of thinking, where it becomes it becomes a logical prevention. I don't want him to attack my system, so I'm going to now deter him by seizing any challenging interpretation that reveals that limitation, right? So I'm going to cover over that limitation by seizing it. And so it makes sense why we want to stay in boxes, because that means we've seized control, and nobody can expose the limit. And I feel like this is such an important concept, because it's really made me think about how this happens so quickly, how we instantly go into the logic of deterring, wanting to seize power. And I think that anxiety-inducing element, that's what distracts us, is that instantly we become racing towards seizing the power rather than saying the truth. so to speak, right? So it becomes this blindsided race to deter rather than to actually have faith and explore what needs to be explored. And to me, if I were to define modernity, I think modernity has this exact logic running throughout it, right? We're trying to prevent anxiety. So we need to deter anxiety now. And so it becomes a race to solve it, a race to with meaning, a race with everything else. But that misses the whole point, like you've been talking about. But yeah.
Excellent. I think that was a wonderful, what you brought in. It was quite nice. And I think that's the tension right now with AI. Do you shut it down or do you just unleash it? Because if everyone has AI, it'd be like nukes, and the Chinese couldn't use it against the Americans without us using back. And you have this interesting tension. Now, what's curious is that if we accept the premise that nuclear deterrence actually gave rise to global enrichment because war was no longer an option, well, then there's something to say that deterrence can actually reach a point that back and forth between prevention and deterrence can reach a point of negation, sublation, of prosperity. Now, arguably, though, that's reversed because we realize, wait a minute, that also means we can't stop Russia and Ukraine. Oh, it works both ways. Shoot. So there's a problem there, right? But then again, you could say, well, maybe the whole reason why Ukraine has been able to stop Russia's strategic and tactical objectives is precisely because of the nuclear deterrence, because the only option Russia could blow up Ukraine if they wanted, but they're kind of deterred from that final option, right? So there's something interesting there about, and I think something could apply with AI as well, right? It could destroy basically all notions of intelligence that are not ultimately general intelligence. Like that's all going to go out. Well, that will be a great terror, but then it would also lead to a dramatic reformation of education to favor creativity, creative thought, to fake jobs that are going to favor creativity and thought. Maybe everyone's saying we need to be embodied again. Well, the robots are not going to be able to do your garden for a long time, at least in a manner that is economically expensive. So there could be a great terror, but in that terror also a negation, sublation. But that's all contingent on us and how we're ready for it. I think basically the internet has announced the end of all limitation strategy, as in a strategy of limitation is over. There's no way you can stop that. So there's basically only one possibility, that limits are not what we think they are. If they are what we think we are, we're done. It's over. This is one of the reasons, like, I never thought I'd do the Germans. I thought I was done with the Scots and the counter-enlightenment, and then finding Hegel and thanks to Cadell and different things, like to have a philosophy where limits are not what we think they are. Well, that changes things because there's no way to do strategies of limits. And we've only organized the world basically through limit strategies, right? Well, that's done. So we have to rethink what a limit is. And as I was saying at the net, I think limits are more like gradients, like sunrises and sunsets, where one color suddenly stops and turns into another color. There is a limit in a gradient, like with a sunset, right? The blue eventually becomes black, and the blue becomes yellow and white and red, right? So there are limits, but what is the nature? Because this is what I guess how I would put it. What we are discovering is that limits are like gradients, where colors just become other colors in the gradient. Is that a limit? Or is there a better word for it? There is a kind of limit, but what we're finding out is that the limits of thinkers are more like where Kierkegaard blurs into Buber like a gradient, right? We're finding out with the internet that all of these things are blurring into one another. So the limitation of Kierkegaard is not like a wall, but it's where Kierkegaard becomes Buber. This is what's weird. Like, we need to metaphorically be able to describe what a gradient in a sunrise or sunset does, because that's what's going on here in regard to Kierkegaard, Buber, and the different thinkers. It's not like they have different houses and you get what you need from one house and you leave and you go to Buber's house and whatever. That's how we've thought about it. But philosophical developmentalism is not like that. What I'm trying to, for me, it's more like a gradient. And what Ebert is describing is more like a gradient, in my view, when he's got his freak theory, you see? And so what we're learning is that philosophy is not a community of different philosophers who have different houses and you go to one house and you go to the next house, okay? I think that's how we've metaphorically thought about it for most of history, is that different philosophers have different houses, you get what you need from one and you go to the next. No. What we see in the great philosophers, at least, and I know great is a loaded term, but the great ones are ones that when you take them to their limit,
they become Buber. It's not that you leave Kierkegaard and enter Buber, they become Buber. Just like in a gradient, the blue becomes yellow and the yellow becomes red. There's a limit, but it's a limit of a gradient. And that's the metaphor. That is what Hegel is describing as history. Hegel describes history as a gradient. He describes philosophy as a gradient. What we see is the development of thought as a gradient. And Hegel says, and if you don't believe me, look for yourself. Look up. You'll see a gradient. It's like a human. Did you ever, like, you as a human were a fetus, a baby, a teenager? It's a gradient. It's not that you were a baby, then there was a wall, and then you're a teen. Now, when you recall it, it's as if it's walls, but it's a gradient. All of nature is a gradient because of time. All of space-time is a gradient. It's not separated. It's all a gradient. And so that's how knowledge is. And discussions online allow for a meta structure of philosophy that is more like nature actually is, as opposed to the debate structure of academia that is too much on the side of space versus time. On the internet, we can make it more like time-space, as opposed to in academia, it's been more like space-time, you see? So what we're seeing is that limitation is more needing to be metaphorically thought in terms of time-space versus space-time. Limit in space-time is a wall, okay, if you just give me the term time-space. Limit in time-space is the gradient of a sunset, okay? And so that's what we're finding. Like all of these philosophies, and we need to discuss and think about philosophers like a gradient, not like a community of different houses. And this is where we screwed up, because we say the school of existentialism, the school of modernity. What are we saying? Our language says there are houses, and you go to different houses and you visit one, and modernity's here and deconstruction's over here. We give them these phrases so they're not a gradient. They're not a gradient. And maybe it should be philosophical gradientism instead of developmentalism. I'll think about it. I might write that down. That might be a better language, actually. Philosophical gradient. Because that's, I want to say evolution, but you can't say that. It's like a gradient, because evolution is too temporal, like the previous dies and the new phase, but a gradient, it's all at once. So a gradient, I think, is a better language, but it's all philosophical. It's all a philosophical gradient. And all of thought is a gradient. And absolute knowing is where we accept that it's a gradient, and that therefore the anxiety is positivized, because the anxiety of, oh me, the red's going to become blue, it's going to become blue. Wait a minute, that's why there's a gradient. If red never became blue, then there couldn't be a gradient. And I would say gradients are way more pretty than just the sky being all red or something. That would be like the Book of Revelation or something creepy, I guess. So a gradient has a certain beauty that is only possible because of the becoming, and the existence of the becoming is not possible without the possibility of anxiety. And so the positivization of anxiety would be the gradient. And what we're finding the more we engage and go through history is that reality is more like it is a gradient than it is a bunch of different separate houses. And I think that's what the internet technology allows. And that's what I think we're seeing in these different thinkers.
Yeah, no, it actually makes me think how my work on timing is that exact emergence of the gradient.
Yes, timing.
Yeah.
That's yes, absolutely.
Timing is the emergence of that gradient. Yeah, because but there is something ironic about it, because it seems like when I had formulated, I have to think about this more. When I had formulated, you know, we're beings in time, so we're being plus time, and that equals timing. That would mean that timing is kind of existential.
Yes, yes, it is completely.
That means that it's up to you to participate in the timing when it provokes you to.
Yes.
That means, and it makes sense, because when we ask, you know, why people had certain, I'm going to use your term, switch moments, when people had certain moments. I think I want to say those are when people honestly gave themselves up to something.
Yes.
That's the only, for me, that has to be the only way that you actually encounter these flip moments, when you honestly give yourself up to something. Because if not, then that means you're not having courage.
That's correct.
What would courage mean? Well, courage means the very thing that you protect yourself from, which is to give up, to surrender to something. I always liked Thomas Wynn's language in this, let. But this is the very, very Hegelian too, looking on, right?
Yes.
Looking on, if I were to really attack this concept, I mean, like looking on is like a real heavy burden that Hegel is asking us to do, to
Yes.
look on, and in the face of uncertainty, and in the face of not knowing,
Yes.
allowing my shapes of consciousness to take form without maybe even possibly knowing what happened until after it's happened. You know, this is not easy stuff to swallow, but it is. I mean, it is a necessity, and that's why I feel like when we bring up all these terms, you know, philosophical gradient, I would say I like that term much better,
Yeah.
because I think developmentalism immediately thinks a kind of like
Hierarchy, as a hierarchy.
yeah, hierarchy, a kind of linear succession. And it took me a while to wrap my mind around what you meant by that. But I think now it's more clear. The gradient makes sense. And I would agree. You know, it's kind of like a pen going into an inkwell. You know, like the water's still there technically. You know,
Yes.
but it's just different now. It's become something else. It's become a mode for ink. So yeah, I think all of these situations. I'm trying to think of. I think some of the things that we struggle with, I'm just trying to phrase it from my own experience, is how do you evoke, provoke someone else's encounter with the gradient, the emergence of this gradient. And what's funny is that you have to be, at least in my experience, I have to be very careful with this provoking, because what ends up happening is that actually it will turn itself on you, meaning like when you realize that fails to provoke, you're actually encountering your own emerging gradient.
Yes.
Right? And that's the part, that's the trap I think that people fall into a lot, because they go, oh, I can't change this person, I give up, and they go into like some nihilistic mode
Yes.
of depression, but they can never get themselves out because it's a constant self-relating negativity, because the conditions just keep extending further and further on, knowing that they can't change the person, and yet they still try, but they don't realize that there's something in that failure that is already telling them like, hey, you're entering a gradient, but you think it's the gradient of the other person that needs to be brought out, but it's actually yours that is trying to be provoked out, which is a very tricky thing to sort out, because I mean it's true that maybe they do need to change, but it's not up to you. You know, it's not up to you, and you quickly understand that it's not up to you. All you can do is simply offer, like I said in my videos before, all you can do is offer sort of like a gift, because fundamentally I really like Kierkegaard's language of the gift, and maybe there's room to even say that the gradient itself is the gift.
Yes, absolutely.
That we are lower, we're all equal, and lower than the gift of the gradient. And that we participate with each other in giving and revealing this gradient. But I have to understand that when my advice works on somebody, it's not my advice. That's the gradient.
Yes.
And I think if I were to add Kierkegaard to that element, it's the gradient itself that is allowing that sort of flip moment.
Yes.
Through a person, through an animal, through whatever. And then here I am incorporating Buber, Kierkegaard, Hegel. You see how this all sinks in, and they start becoming each other slowly in thought.
Yes, and notice how you did that, because you based it on experience of trying to change people and knowing you can't. Like you were able to bring together because of a phenomenological experience.
There's a third thing you brought in, and now they go together. If you're not allowed to bring in that third thing, they don't go together, so you get infinite academic debates that don't go anywhere. So you brought in something, and then you see how they go together. I fear I'll have to run in about 15 minutes. I've really enjoyed this, my friend. My goal is to keep you for a really long time. But, you know, alas, I won't get to the limitation. There's a few things. Basically, flip moments require choice or they're just change. So there's a question of what's the difference between change and becoming. So you seem to have stagnancy and you have change. Those are trapped in a dichotomy, but becoming seems to be outside that dichotomy. And it seems something to have to do with choice, notion, nature, owning, courage, and things like that. Also, the only timing has to be existential because timing is you plus time. Timing is only possible if a subject makes a choice in time, right? So it's inherently existential. So timing is you plus time. And what we're finding, if we follow Hegel, is that the existence of time and the existence of you are bound up because nature and notion are bound up in extremely profound ways. And so it's all timing once the subject develops. Once you get to that moment in history where the subject arises, then timing is more primary than time, because now you have a subject of whom can become in time if they are aware of the choice and the difference between a flip moment and mere change. And that's a gradient. That's where it's not where like before, like in Hegel, when history develops, history itself is a gradient. So there's a time before the subject arises evolutionarily to then make a distinction between change and becoming. Up to that point, it's basically stagnancy or change. Then the subject arises, and now you have a third category of stagnancy, change, and becoming. That does not mean the previous was bad. It just means now you've had a flip moment, and now you have to think and operating according to that contingency that has been realized, that change that has been realized. So things are different. It also makes me think on change, there's like you could not care to change someone. Then there's the trying to change them, but then there's attracting. Like not change or change is that dichotomy. Attracting is where you don't try to change them, but you show them a way of life that makes them on their own want it, and so they change on the way, right? And then in that attraction, they simultaneously become the kind of subject who wants to receive it. The problem with trying to change people is they haven't changed as a subject who want to change, and so they don't. Attraction tends to change people in their movement toward it. And this is where I start talking about how beauty is the fate of us. Beauty is primarily in this discussion because beauty, and this is why I like the language of gradient as well, is because gradients are beautiful. And so you're attracted to think of the world in those terms and to be like those terms. On your notion of gift as well, let's say you were nearsighted and I handed you a pair of glasses. Would those glasses be a gift? Yeah, because you can't really see very well without them, right? So glasses can be a gift, right? So this is Hegel's insight. Ideas are glasses. And if I give you different ideas and change how you see the world, and you see the world better, you may suffer more anxiety. You may suffer more positivized anxiety as opposed to more effacing anxiety. Basically, if everyone is feeling anxiety, that means everyone is quote unquote nearsighted. Everyone needs a pair of glasses. The very existence of the anxiety is evidence of the need for a negation sublation. Those glasses are the notion of reality as a gradient. So you give people those glasses, they put those glasses on, and now they can see. It's like it's a gift. Now I can see the world in terms of a gradient. And so this is where ideas are gifts, because ideas are lenses. Ideas are practically eyes. And so if you give someone the glasses by which to see reality as a gradient, well, everything is less confusing. Because it's like, how can Kierkegaard and Buber be so different? I don't understand, because they're part of a gradient. Oh, I don't have to choose now. Because before you're like, I have to choose, am I Kierkegaard, am I Buber? It's like, no, you don't. They're part of a gradient. You just have to go with it. You have to move. You have to be acting and courageous that going with it will take you somewhere that you want to be. And so what you see is that glasses in this way are a gift to see the gradient, of which one realizes they need those glasses because of the anxiety, that without that anxiety, you would never feel those glasses. And a reason we have not really felt the anxiety until now is because history had not arrived at a flip moment in which that was required. We have not needed to see reality per se in terms of a gradient until now, but the very fact that you are feeling anxiety is evidence that history has now changed. History is kind of smoke to a fire per se. Anxiety is smoke to a fire. I mean, if you're feeling the anxiety, that means there's a fire, ergo a need for a change, okay? And that need for the change is to see things in terms of a gradient, to have on a new pair of glasses. So anxiety is an indication of a changing historic epoch. And that historic epoch is changing to one of thinking in terms of philosophical gradientism, as opposed to philosophical hierarchy, or whose side are you on, of which academia has embodied. But now that we have the internet, I think things can be different.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in this situation. I'm pretty sure you have. I feel like this is a mutual experience. where somebody says, okay, whose side do you take?
Yeah.
And, you can experience this with friends, right? Do you take his side or do you take my side, right? Instantly, you feel a type of anxiety, right? But what's funny is that we typically associate this anxiety with like, oh, I have to choose between one or the other. We never think about the third thing.
Yeah.
Third thing is, wait, there's another possibility. There's another possibility of me not choosing both of them, or maybe choosing both of them at the same time. Like, what is that possibility? I don't know what that possibility is. And then so already anxiety is taking you on the path of right ordering.
Yes.
A choice. I really like thinking anxiety as encountering that sort of. I like Ebert's language here, like a kind of infinite moment.
Yes.
Encounter of an infinite moment, because I mean, I can understand why it's so scary, because if you encounter the infinite moment, there's so many possibilities. You can't even know what the possibility is that you want to entertain.
That's right.
And that's why it involves a choice. And that means you have to sacrifice.
Yes.
And that means you have to have courage.
Yes.
You have to be like, I'm going with this possibility. Out of all possibilities, I'm picking this possibility.
That's right.
And then constantly you are re-provoked again to pick another possibility amongst those possibilities that you are caught in. And every single time we're asking, what is that possibility? Well, that's something that you have to answer. That's something that you have to do. So automatically within that choice, responsibility, freedom, courage, existence. What does it mean to be another? What does it mean to be a part of a community rather than a part of a collective?
That's right.
And you can see how this automatically goes into so many gradients. Like anxiety seems to be the provoker of all these gradients. And if you don't respond to it, then you just get stuck into this whole thing of the Zizek's, snake eating its tail kind of thing. Because that's still a possibility it entertains.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you either have to undergo the negation sublation or it's auto-cannibalism, which is eating yourself, auto-cannibalism.
It's interesting because if we say it's both Kierkegaard and Buber, then we're also saying it's neither, because neither of them thought it was both, right? So every bothness is a both with a slash through it. That's what we're doing. Like the philosophical gradientism is a both with a slash through it, like being with a slash through it, right? So it's both and neither, and it's that weird double move where the vanishing of the vanishing, right? This doubleness that occurs. It also goes to show you, though, like you have the anxiety online of like, oh, we don't disagree, or I have to choose, or I'm not choosing. Is it bad to want both, or I'm always working toward both? You have a lot of these people online feeling that anxiety as evidence that they're doing it wrong, when actually the anxiety comes from being on the edge of the new way of doing philosophy that entails that bothness with the slash to it. But you feel that weirdness because it's still in contrast with the institutional structure that is in the old paradigm. So you're saying they're doing it that way. What if I'm doing it wrong? The anxiety of doing it wrong could be evidence you're doing it wrong, or it could be evidence that you're doing it right. And of course, it has to legitimately be evidence that you might be doing it wrong, or it wouldn't be anxiety. So the anxiety has to have a risk. Funny enough, trying to avoid the feeling of what if I'm just like trying to be, consume everyone. What if I'm just trying to be in the middle because I'm afraid? That right there is the fear you need to face. Like that's the funny meta move. Like, and actually saying, well, I'm going to be more like the institutions now. That's not facing the fear. That's actually running from the fear. That's the weird move. That's where we start to see why it's a virtual object. The anxiety is like, no, I'm going to freaking keep facing the anxiety because I believe this is the edge of what we need to go on, not evidence that we're in the wrong way. That's why anxiety becomes this thing that you face in of itself that is a virtual object, because when you encounter the anxiety of, oh, what if I'm doing this wrong because it's not like academia? If you run to be like academia, you say, well, I faced my fear and I admitted that I didn't want to take its stand. And I admitted that I was unwilling to take a position. So I went back to academia. All that looks like you faced your fear, but actually you ran from it. Really facing the anxiety is to take a stand and say, no, I know that I am willing to change my view if it's wrong. I know that I am generally bringing Kierkegaard and Buber together because I believe they need to come together, not because I'm afraid of commitment, but because I have done the work to see that they need to come together. And although it feels like I might just be interpreting in a manner to make myself feel better, I'm going to face that fear. I'm going to take that risk, and I'm going to take that stand because I believe that we are dealing with a gradient, not a community of houses where you have to pick your tribe. And so facing that, if nobody faces that anxiety and stays in the place of that anxiety, you cannot have the negation sublation into the next phase. And without that next phase of philosophical gradientism that we need to think as a catchphrase for everything we've discussed, if we don't do that, AI's got us. AI is going to efface us. So the stakes are real, but that requires facing the fear of doing it wrong. And if you're not willing to face the fear of doing it wrong because you're nervous, well, then what you fear is what comes unto you. You know, and so it is extremely important to face one's fears because the one who fears is not made perfect in love.
Yeah, I think this is why I love that Hegel quote in the beginning of the introduction, where he says, "The fear of error is the fear of truth." Right?
Exactly.
There it is. That is the very mechanism of anxiety.
Yes.
That is what I think Kierkegaard is also saying. The fear of error is the fear of truth. So we cannot be afraid. And I'm always fascinated by the Bible verses that always say, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to go hungry, to eat. I will provide," and everything else. It's taken me such a long time to actually understand that logic, because I think Kierkegaard really capitalizes on this fear of like, oh yeah, like thinking about not eating is really scary. It's actually really anxiety inducing. And so how does a man ironically face this? And Kierkegaard's response to this is actually this twist where he says, actually, there's nothing wrong with you worrying about it. The only part that you go wrong is trying to avoid it.
Yes.
And this is how you sublimate it. This is what Kierkegaard says. He goes, in the face of anxiety that you decide to be carefree, that's perfection.
Yes.
That, when you decide to be carefree in the face of anxiety, for Kierkegaard, that is perfection. That is you being a human being. Because nobody else, at least from Kierkegaard's understanding, can do that.
Right.
We are the only animals that can have anxiety and then choose to not choose to be carefree in that case. Yeah. And so that's why I don't even see the difference. I mean, I see the difference between Kierkegaard and Hegel, but on those fundamental lines, they blur immediately for me, because I think Kierkegaard's saying the same thing as Hegel does when he says, "Do not fear error, because the truth is there." Yes. The fear of error is the fear of truth. So, yeah, I think we end there.
Well, and again, it brings to mind, you were speaking Jesus on the cross, right? It's very interesting. When Jesus on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Elo, Elo, Sabachthani.
Yeah.
Why isn't that a sin? Doesn't he doubt? I know. Why isn't that a sin? Jesus is perfect, right? What's very interesting is right there, that goes to show you that what counts is not what you feel, but what you do. Because he still dies on the cross. He still accepted every pain. And so he gets resurrected, even though on the cross, he feels the anxiety. He feels the doubt. He feels the loss. And the profundity there is that means the feeling of the loss of God. The feeling of the loss of God is at the very heart of God's self. God himself is constituted by a being of which undergoes its own loss. And that loss just turns out not to be a loss at all. It turns out to be a resurrection. Resurrection is only possible where there is death. And resurrection turns out to be higher than life. You have life, you have death. They're in the dichotomy. Resurrection's over here. Resurrection is becoming, where stagnancy and change is over here. And what you see in Jesus is a reality that it is the doing that counts. And so it's likewise, humans can face. It is possible for a human being to face and feel anxiety and do something contrary to it. We're not just a billiard ball being hit by another billiard ball and moving, right? We're able to be hit by a billiard ball and not move. And the uniqueness of the human being
versus say the rock or the leaf. The leaf must move in the wind. The rock must roll down the hill. The human, of course, is going to roll some, but they're able to stop it, right? The screaming pronunciation of what it means to be human is the ability to get hit by another billiard ball and not move, to stand there and take the pain, not to go with it, to get on a cross and feel like this is nuts and yet still do it, to have the ability to say, everyone says this is an error, that this is a mistake, and it really, really feels like it's a mistake, but I'm going to believe there's truth there. And this is what makes us human. And if we fail to be human in this way, then we are no better than inanimate objects. And of course, we should be replaced by AI because it's the superior inanimate object.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But with that, Javier, I fear I must go. This has been a delightful. I've kept you for 2 hours and 30 minutes. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Javier, I really enjoyed speaking with you, sir. I hope we get to do it again soon.
Same. It was wonderful.
It was.
Thanks.
Thank you, Javier.
All right.
It's been a delight, sir.